Now, more than ever, we need healing stories and narratives that give us hope. Later in this video, you'll join me in a powerful interview with Marina, an award-winning journalist and peace activist who's been studying the power of forgiveness for years, even in the most unlikely of places. From gang members on opposite sides of the game to countless victims and perpetrators of war and genocide, her nonprofit, the Forgiveness Project, has collected hundreds of inspiring stories of people who are transforming their traumas, forgiving themselves and those who have harmed them, and thus breaking the cycle of suffering and violence. Because life is morally complicated, and the lines between right and wrong, black and white, good guys versus bad guys, often aren't as clear-cut as we may want them to be. Yet Cantacuzino isn't offering a prescription, since forgiveness isn't the same for everyone. As she says in her book, to forgive is technically a verb like to jump or to eat, but you can't just go out and learn how to do it. From her research and the stories she's collected, forgiveness is contextual, serving as a heartfelt intention to liberate ourselves from our pain and a journey to create deeper meaning out of our experiences. Here's a powerful excerpt of Rami Elhanan's story that I learned from the Forgiveness Project. Rami, an Israeli graphic designer, became friends with Ghazi Bourgif, a Palestinian electrician. They met through the Parent Circle, a group of bereaved families supporting reconciliation and peace. Ghazi's brother was killed at a checkpoint, and Rami's 14-year-old daughter was the victim of a suicide bombing. I was on my way to the airport when my wife called and told me Smadar was missing. When something like this happens, a cold hand grabs your heart. You rush between friends' houses and hospitals, then eventually you find yourself in the morgue, and you see a sight you'll never forget for the rest of your life. From that moment, you are a new person. Everything is different. I don't forgive and I don't forget. But when this happened to my daughter, I had to ask myself whether I'd contributed in any way. The answer was that I had. My people had. For ruling, dominating, and oppressing 3.5 million Palestinians for 35 years. It is a sin, and you pay for the sins. At first, I foolishly thought I could just go back to work and resume my life, but the pain was unbearable. Then, a year later, I met Yitzhak Frankenthal, the founder of the Parent Circle. He was wearing a kippah on his head, and immediately I stereotyped him as an Arab eater. Even when he told me his personal story and about the reconciliation work of Parent Circle, I was very cynical. He invited me to a meeting, and reluctantly I went along. I saw buses full of people, parents who had lost kids in wars and who still wanted peace. I saw an Arab lady in a long black dress. On her chest was a picture of a 6-year-old kid. A singer sang in Hebrew and Arabic, and suddenly I was hit by lightning. I can't explain it, but from that moment on, I had a reason to get up in the morning again. Since then, my work with the Parent Circle has become the center of my life, a sacred mission. If we, Ghazi and I, can talk and stand together after paying the highest price possible, then anyone can. There is a high wall between our two nations, a wall of hate and fear. Someone needs to put cracks in the wall in order for it to fall down. At the heart of the matter is that we're all human, with our own needs and unique stories of oppression. Yet most of us come from families, cultures, and societies where compassion and communication for those on the other side are seen as signs of weakness, where economic and political decisions of governments force its people to do unspeakable things in the name of justice. We're taught that justice means revenge and getting even. Yet time and time again, we see that this only contributes and amplifies the cycle of violence. As social justice activist Aurora Levins Morales once said, as people committed to creating just and peaceful societies, we have a responsibility to understand how the unjust and violent societies we live in sustain and recreate themselves, how brutality reproduces, How the son of a Polish Jewish refugee can become the key strategist of world conquest for the grandson of Prescott Bush, who laundered money for Tyson, Nazi Germany's most prominent steel manufacturer, who used Jewish slave labor in his operations. How the Harlem-born son of Jamaican immigrants, raised in a city that devoured young Black men, became the man who helped to cover up the My Lai massacre of Vietnamese civilians. We have learned about the cycles of abuse within families, about the way a child who was beaten and abused can grow up believing there are only two choices, victim and perpetrator, and can become an adult who feels like a victim while acting like a perpetrator. But somehow, as activists, we have failed to see the immense implications of that knowledge for the work of social change. Over and over, I see movements of liberation get stuck at that same place, the moment when we other the agents of our oppression without trying to understand why they are as they are. If we even begin to ask those questions, we are rapidly drawn to the places where we ourselves have been most deeply wounded. And the exact place where it is most difficult to understand how anyone could do as our enemies have done and still be human is the place of greatest potential illumination. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Marina Cantacuzino. Marina, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you, Amber.
Yes. Yes, we met at a book reading in Minneapolis last weekend, and I immediately reached out to ask for an interview because I was so touched by your work and what you do.
And I'm back in London now.
Right. 6-hour time difference between us, yet here we are in the present moment.
Lovely.
Yeah. Well, I thought we'd start off with a brief grounding mindfulness practice to get our hearts and minds aligned together. Marina and I will share poems after, and then we'll launch into the interview. Okay. So just tuning inwards. If it feels right to close the eyes, go ahead and close. Or just keeping a soft gaze downward. Settling into where our body touches the ground or the chair or wherever we're lying and being. Taking a big breath in and exhaling. And with every breath in, we let our chest and belly expand outwards. So just letting our inhales fill up our lungs. And then when we exhale, our shoulders relax, our face relaxes anywhere that we feel tension. Expanding to honor all the beings, seen and unseen, in the midst of war, violence, and suffering. Just expanding our hearts. We're here to expand on our common desire to meet that sorrow, to meet the world's suffering with courage, service, and an open heart. Joining all the people right now, all over the world, in this present moment, who all share this common desire. I cannot turn my eyes. I cannot count the cost of all that has been broken, all that has been lost. I cannot understand the suffering that life brings, war and hate and hunger, and a million other things. When I've done all that I can, and I try to do my part, let sorrow be a doorway into an open heart. And the light on the hills is full of mercy. The wind in the trees, it comes to save me. This silence, it will never desert me. I long to hold the whole world in these arms.
The guest house. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honourably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond.
Very beautiful. Thank you for sharing that poem. Wow.
And thank you for sharing yours. What I love about that poem by Rumi, and so it's many centuries old, is that it is about welcoming of our darkest side. And it's not about not pushing it away, and about learning from it and moving forward and creating meaning out of hopelessness. And it sort of chimes with my work, I think. So I always love to read that poem.
You've just written this book, Forgiveness and Exploration, which I know isn't your first book on forgiveness. How did your journey as a journalist inspire you to study forgiveness?
When I think about this question, it goes back right to the beginning of my work as a journalist, why I even started to write. And it goes back to me wanting to tell my own story of pain around growing up in a family with a terminally ill brother, younger brother, who I always knew was going to die. And it's a very strange, it was a very happy childhood when I look back. And yet there was this terrible sadness, but we all knew he would die young, and indeed he died at 17. So I thought I'll write an article about what it's like to be a sibling of a disabled, terminally ill brother, and discovered a group that was called SIBS, which was called Support and Information for Brothers and Sisters. So I interviewed the woman who ran this. So I put the article in the post and sent it off to the Guardian newspaper here in the UK. I think I start here because it explains perhaps why I became a journalist, because I was very comfortable around stories of pain and sorrow. I concentrated on collecting stories from people who had been through a lot, who needed to share, who were campaigning for justice. And then the Iraq War happened, which was the real spur to working with forgiveness, because I was very angry at that, Amber. I went on the march. It was exactly 21 years ago, and no one listened. And the war and the invasion of Iraq happened. And I thought, well, as a journalist, I've got a small voice. What can I do? Why don't we seek out stories which were countercultural, an antidote to the angry language of revenge and retaliation and payback that was being spoken by politicians and acted out and repeated in the media. And I wanted to find different types of stories. I wanted to find stories of victims and survivors who had experienced atrocity and crime, but who had responded had restorative responses. And along the way, I thought, well, it'd be also interesting to talk to perpetrators who had transformed their aggression into a force for peace. Some of those stories became restorative justice stories, people who had met because of the crime. You know, the perpetrator and the victim stood side by side, and we photographed them, and I collected the story and wrote up the story. And this then became an exhibition called The F Word, because by now I knew forgiveness was highly contentious, cut public opinion down the middle like a guillotine. People either were affronted by it or inspired by it, wanting to tell stories of sorrow and pain. And then it's sort of morphing into much more than that, because actually these stories needed to be stories of hope. And I think that's why this exhibition that launched in January 2004 in London was phenomenally successful at that time. They were stories of hope. They shone a light through darkness at this particularly bleak time. And that's why I started the not-for-profit called the Forgiveness Project, because I thought we can use these stories in multiple ways. And a lot of it was around finding meaning in pain and sorrow. And I saw that pain was the greatest motivator to forgive as well.
The F word exhibit has been shown in multiple places across the world, right?
It has. It's been to about 19 countries, to 99,000 people have seen it, and very diverse venues from the fire station, hospital, shopping mall, multiple faith organizations, lots of colleges and universities and corporates. One thing that is clear is that forgiveness is a great conversation talking point. Everyone's got an opinion on it. Everyone has different definition of it. And I think why the exhibition was so successful is that there was no preaching, no attempt to convert or persuade. I see it really as a landscape, a territory of which forgiveness is part. But it might be compassion, it might be understanding, it might be empathy, it might be reconciliation or restorative justice. All those are part of the landscape that I'm working in. Forgiveness probably is the most tricky one to navigate. I think stories have an authenticity about them. When someone is vulnerable enough and honest enough to tell you how they felt and what happened, and these are difficult stories very often.
Maybe you could share one or two of the most powerful examples or stories that you've encountered in your work.
And it's the story of Mathew. I write about him in the chapter about personal forgiveness, which I call the oil of personal relationships, because I see forgiveness as really vital in a way to keep relationships going. And that's not to say that occasionally the relationship is so damaging that you have to walk away. In everyday life, when I think about forgiveness, I think we do it, we practice it all the time in tiny ways. So Mathew Shurka lives in New York. He was put through a version of conversion therapy by his father. When he was about 16, he came out to his father as a young gay man. And his father strongly identified for his Jewish religion. His father just wasn't having any of it and said, this is not normal, and took him to conversion therapy. And over 2 years, he had to be in the same house as his two sisters and his mother and not speak to them. Apart from having to have girlfriends, being given Viagra, forcing him to have heterosexual sexual relationship. He was convinced he was bad. He was full of shame. And for 2 years, he would get cross with his mother if she just even touched him, patted him, or said hello in the morning. He said, don't talk to me. You're ruining it. And the way he described it, I thought was very, just so sad, actually, what he went through. He, in the end, knows he can't change his true nature, breaks off with his father. Parents divorce. This has all become a hugely problematic thing within the family. And Mathew actually believes that he probably will never see his father again, who by now has gone to live in Israel. This meaning-making thing is very interesting, and it is part of what it means to forgive. You use it to put meaning back into your life. And he started something called Born Perfect, which was a campaigning group, survivor-led national movement working with legal experts to pass legislation outlawing conversion therapy. So he put meaning back into his life, but he still held on to all the resentment and hatred, bitterness towards his father. And after doing a personal development course, he told me that he had decided that this was unfinished business, that he wanted to find resolution with his father. And he went over to Israel to confront him, to meet him, to see if anything could be made of this broken relationship with his father. So much easier in a way to say, I'm never going to see you again. The reason why this story resonates, I know so many people who have put up a barrier to family members, or had family members put up the barrier to them. And then all friendships. That's it, never speaking to you. As I say, necessary sometimes, but so often very unnecessary. And it could be mended, which is what Mathew tried to do. So he met him, they had dinner, nothing was said, they went for a walk, and then his father says, are you still doing the therapy? And he says, no, Dad, I'm living as a gay man. And the father goes off on one. You shouldn't do it. You're ruining your life. For the first time, he doesn't react like he used to. He doesn't shout at his father. He sees his father as a loving father who wants the best for his son. And he keeps calm. And when his father had finished, he hugs his father and he kisses him on the cheek and he looks him in the eyes and then he says, don't worry, Dad. You've got nothing to worry about. I'm all right. I'm happy. I'm leading the life I want to. His father kind of looks stunned. And he says, okay. And they hug. And that's the end of it. He's about to get married, Matthew, and I'm not sure his father's going along to the wedding. So obviously not all is resolved. Nothing ever is always resolved.
Right.
But it was a beautiful story for me because he got his father back. He reconstructed a tender and loving relationship with his father. He forgave his father by walking into his father's territory and not responding out of anger. He sees that his father loves him and thinks this is the way to help his son. So it's all one of the key ingredients of forgiveness is perspective change, perspective taking, that you can enter into this perspective and have curiosity for the life of the person who's hurt you. And that in turn builds an empathy and a letting go of the resentment.
There's something about a response that's loving and open that first disarms people,
Yeah,
because I think most of us, especially in family systems, that defensive mind can really become a norm and a habit. Martin Luther King said that, love your enemies, because when they see that, it first of all confuses them.
yeah,
But there's something about love that's so creative and generative. And
yeah,
there's something about hate and anger, no matter how justified, that's so destructive.
I think that's right.
You know, another story about family that I read on the Forgiveness Project, and also it was in your book, about the story of Samantha Lawler, who
Yeah.
was the daughter of the man who murdered her mother and
Mm,
strangled her to death. Talk about layers of trauma and understanding when it comes to that lived experience of hers. And when she visited him in prison and he was all tied up to a
mm,
ventilator, so
mm,
sick, suffering,
mm,
and she couldn't help but be confronted with the magnitude of his pain. And I
mm.
love what she said, that forgiveness is not about forgiving the act, but forgiving the imperfections that
Yeah,
are inherent in all
right.
of us.
That's right. And I like what she says when she saw him, dying in a hospital prison ward, tied up in chains. She said, so this is what punishment looks like. Didn't give her any joy to see him in that
Mhm.
pathetic, dehumanized state.
Just as your poem, Rumi's poem that you shared with us, it seems like one key ingredient of forgiveness is really welcoming whatever's here.
Mm,
Like in the stories I read, I felt the rage and I felt the sense of injustice. Um, and it was okay. Just doing restorative justice work at the high school, my job was to bring people together, not just students and youth, but police officers and school administrators and parents and community members over really difficult topics.
yeah,
From fighting at school to what should we do about police officers, to real and perceived harm from people in power at the school and the families. And you get these people together, and a powerful circle could really get people to sacrifice their stories that they had as the exclusive truth in order to open up to a bigger truth. And
yeah,
I remember I was doing a circle with a bunch of girls who were gonna be all suspended and some of them expelled for getting into a fight on campus, and they were dragging their hair across the campus. And the police officer didn't even want me to do this circle without him in the room because he felt that, it was totally unsafe. And I was like, no, we need some healing, because I knew all of these girls and I knew their lives. And if
mm,
they only knew
mm,
that a lot of what they went through in their homes and on the streets were very similar, things might change. So we were in that circle and it was getting pretty intense. And I just paused and I said, we're all here and we agreed to be here in this circle. And I just want you all to remember what I talked to each of you about what you ultimately want. What do you want? And one of the girls paused and then she sighed and was like, look, I'm just not trying to catch a case, because she was on probation. She's like,
right,
I don't want to get in trouble, but when you harm my brother like that, I'm not just going to let you do it. And then the other girls were like when you started bullying my cousin, I couldn't handle that. The very things they were upset with each other about were things that they would have never let happen, both of them, and things that they wanted to protect.
yeah,
All of a sudden, it was like something shifted just like that. And then they became friends, and that was one of my most positive outcomes.
I mean, I've found that the circle work we use circle work quite a lot to have difficult conversations. There's something about the equality of everyone having a chance to speak and not dominating. By the time it comes to you to say what you've been longing to say, you may have changed your mind because of what you've heard in between. So some deep listening is allowed.
Getting down to the needs, like what is this person needing, right? And not just the expression of their communication or the words they're saying, but what is this person really needing? Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of nonviolent communication, he said that once people connect with their needs, they often experience a sense of calming down. Their nervous system relaxes a little bit more. And what would it be like if we practice that? It's like, what do you need? Not just what you did. It can change the game.
Yeah. And a lot of the people that we work with, their need is to be witnessed and heard. So already in the telling of the story, there is healing. I think when I started out, I did have a very naive view of what forgiveness was, that it was a sort of panacea for all ills, a magical place where you could arrive at, where things were fixed, cure-all, closure. And I very soon was disillusioned of that idea. And I think if I've learned one thing, it is that forgiveness is multifaceted, multidimensional, easily misunderstood, open to interpretation, not always welcome, and not always appropriate, actually. There are situations, there's a thing called radical forgiveness, which I couldn't get on with it, actually. And it was very much like everyone should forgive, should. That, I think Marshall Rosenberg called that the most violent word in the English language. But radical forgiveness is everyone should forgive everything in order to be happy. If we can forgive the guy across the road for stealing our milk on the pavement, we should forgive Hitler. And that was how it's framed. And I just thought that was very difficult and problematic. And there's a chapter in the book called The Dark Side for me to look at areas that it's not helpful to talk about forgiveness. It's not appropriate. It's not needed. Ta-Nehisi Coates, the African-American writer who wrote his memoir was called Between the World and Me, talks about a friend of his who is killed by a police officer. And many in his community were offering forgiveness. The Black community quickly came to forgive the police officer. And he's saying the need to forgive the police officer would not have moved me, because even then I knew that Prince was not killed by a single officer, but that he was killed by a country and all the fears that have marked it from birth. I did not believe in forgiveness. And Misha Cherry, who's an academic in America again, has written a book just come out recently called The Failures of Forgiveness. And she goes a lot into this and about how Black communities, Black folk are expected to forgive. It's almost like a default position. They're often asked by journalists, have you forgiven? Whereas they wouldn't ask that of white people necessarily. So then you have to ask, is that to make the story just much easier? Are they forgiven? That's easier, So I think these debates are really interesting. And then the whole thing is when Black people forgive, is it a permission slip for police brutality? And then I read someone a victim of African-American again, he'd lost a family member, I think, and he'd talked about forgiveness early on. And he said forgiveness had always been very central to his life. And to be told his forgiveness was promoting white police brutality was a further victimization on him. So this again just showed to me the complexity of this.
Right.
That there is no simple. Everyone comes from a different position. Everyone has a different interpretation. But I can put it out there and suggest things. Like I can suggest to you that if I suddenly told you that I forgive you, you could say that sounds a bit like an accusation, because say we've had a row, we both think we're equally justified, and it's complex, and anyone around us can see both sides. And I say, well, listen, Amber, I'm going to forgive you now. I'm immediately saying I'm right and you're wrong. And it becomes an accusation. So there are it's a nuanced debate to be having. And I think in the midst of violent conflict, when people are hell-bent on killing each other, on survival, on power, it's not a helpful, it's not a helpful attribute to promote, because it's much more part of repairing broken relationship, mending broken hearts, resolving things that have got stuck. It's the aftermath of conflict. I think in the heat of battle, there are other things going on.
Well, what you just said reminds me of an inspiring news article we just summarized about Loretta Ross's work, who is a civil rights activist. She's a professor, and she had a very traumatizing upbringing of rape and incest. When she got older, worked with men in prison who were incarcerated for raping or sexually assaulting women, and then also worked with people who were leaving the KKK. She had major unlearnings to do about how she perceived these people who she deemed as the oppressors, and had such remarkable awakenings that now she teaches about the power of calling in versus calling out. Calling in is an act of love, calling out is an act of further contributing to the cycle of violence. But she
Mm,
said something that was so interesting. I have it up here. I just loaded it because it just came up. Some of the tactics for seeking accountability is a lot of that cancel culture, blame and shame, and eggshell culture, which is something that I said about a lot of progressive movements now, is like people feel like they're walking on eggshells and they have
yeah.
to say the right thing. Um, and if you're white, you're the enemy. Um, and if you're a person of color, you're a victim. And there's a lot of circular firing squads within progressive communities about accountability and justice. And she says, though, that these tactics don't often leave room for discussion. And so here she has a conversation with the Black woman. I'm confused, the woman says to Loretta Ross. I don't want to fall into the stereotype of the angry Black woman, but I feel like if I embrace the calling in strategies you're talking about, then I'm going to give a pass to all this injustice. What should I do? And Ross responds with a question of her own. Well, who are you inside?
Mm,
Go deep inside, find out who you are. What's the emotion that you feel is true to you?
mm,
And the woman sits and says, well, inside, I feel like I'm filled with love. And Loretta Ross says, then why aren't you leading with your authentic self?
mm,
If you feel love inside, lead with love.
mm,
And it's not really about what's right or wrong or what's moral or not moral. But it's really about, what do you want? Like,
mm,
how do you want to express yourself in the world, and then fiercely commit to that, which does take sacrifice, because there are parts of ourselves that hold pain and trauma and anger for what they've experienced. Looking at the current conflicts, and so many of the stories in the Forgiveness Project is about Israelis and Palestinians coming together across decades of trauma and pain and hurt on all sides, and all the other conflicts in the world. What do you see as the most pressing questions or areas of exploration related to forgiveness?
How does the Forgiveness Project speak into this extreme polarization that we're seeing around gender, race, conflict issues? And I think I often think, where does forgiveness actually fit in when people have very strong positions and opinions from which they're wedded, actually? And the righteous anger, which can be very helpful, righteous anger, it gets things done and it gives people purpose. But what happens when it becomes so stuck, when you've ceased to see the pain of the other? So with the Israel-Palestine, there's this whole thing now against both sidism. So people like the Forgiveness Project, who are working with a group called the Parents Circle, which is a bereaved group in Israel and Palestine from both sides, who for years have been working together. It's a peace group. They want to end the occupation. They're against the settlers. They have a political stance, but most of all, they are human beings who are grieving and who are working together in peace and who are equal. And yet they're accused again of both sidism, because they're seeing the pain, each side is seeing the pain of the other. And then the whole question of proportionality comes in. And all I would say around that is that we try to share the stories of both sides, because you can talk about proportionality forever. I don't know if you've got it so much of J.K. Rowling in the US. who has become, is gender critical, is accused of being a transphobe, etc. There's an element of cruelty to her tweets. She's so full of righteous anger and so convinced she's right. She's got such a wide platform. Let's just take the right and wrong of her argument around gender out of it. It's literally that her tweets are cruel, in my view. And you could say, oh, she gets cruel tweets. And she probably does. But she has a platform and she has a position and she has a responsibility, in my view, to create a more peaceful world. And she's doing the opposite. So, and I don't know where forgiveness fits in to that. I think the whole thing around cancel culture is that it doesn't really leave any place for forgiveness because there's nothing to forgive because it's been cancelled.
From people from all sides of the political spectrum, even those that are deemed as conspiracy theorists to mainstream media, yet have very valid concerns, yet their expression of their concerns are so polarizing. It doesn't really leave any room for nuance and bridging, right? If you're saying, if you're bringing in things that people may not have heard, it's the exact opposite of what you hear from the media you consume. It's really important that we have some bridging, and questions are a great start to that.
Yeah.
As Peter Block, who's a really good community builder leader, he said, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's certainty and being right. It's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying, basic communication. If all of us, especially those with influence and power on social media, role modeled curiosity, I wonder how different our collective conversations would be.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the nuances that you keep foregrounding, and I feel just the beautiful potential, and I also feel the gray zones and kind of the parts where my stomach gets into a knot because it's complex and it's like, oh, I want to have completion. What gives you hope for the future?
We don't really know what's coming around the corner. A Buddhist definition of suffering is clinging to that which changes. Everything changes all the time. And that, that does give me hope. And there's a generation out there coming up, because I know a lot of young people have a lot of difficulties, largely because of social media and economics and conflict. I think their lives are much more. I've got 3 children, but the youngest is 26. And I think actually they had a much easier time of it. It was the generations behind them that really had a difficult time, are and still having a difficult time with constant communication, never more communicated and yet never more alone in a way. So that's why I'm going to the children today. Who knows what they're going to turn into?
In all my experience working with the Gen Zers, I was constantly challenging myself to not lump them into one group of youth who just constantly stuck on their phones. I kept meeting such amazing gems and they were finding each other. So
Lovely.
it sounds like people can find you on the Forgiveness Project.
theforgivenessproject.com. Yeah, you'll find all our platforms there.
Well, thank you so much, Marina, for spending time with me in this last hour to share your wisdom, your nuanced wisdom.
And thank you for the conversation, Amber. It's been very interesting and very deep and
Oh.
meaningful.